Once again, good afternoon to you. We meet again for our online discussion, the series that we normally do over the weekends. Today, we're going to discuss about the main component of the so-called research proposal. And our today discussion is mainly focused for the beginners, whom they were trying to ask about what are the main component of the research proposal. If I am asked to write a research proposal, what component should I consider myself, and how can I go through? So today's presentation, we're going to elaborate the main component of this research proposal, and I will be trying to explain on each component with its component to be attached to. And at the end of the day of this presentation, you'll be in the position to write a good and a strong a research proposal. So I have tried to combine this and generalize them into only 10 components. I've tried to make them in 10 components so that it becomes easier for you to grasp and understand. At first, when you speak, we will understand about the number 10. It will be easier to make a row flow from the number 1 to number 10. Here we have, let me take my pen so that will be good for us to highlight. Yes, this one, use this one. Normally, the component of this research proposal varies from an institution to another. It also varies from one objective to another, depending on the nature or the type of the proposal itself could influence its components. But all in all, these are the general ones, particularly on the academic related research, where we are mainly focused. We have to know that within this research proposal, we have the title, we have an abstract. I have tried to explain the types of abstract that we have, the type of abstract which can be written before an individual has the data in hands. That's another type of abstract. Then we'll have then so-called introduction, where we have the background introduction and some reviews of literature. And then it has number 4, which is the so-called objectives, where we find the specific and the general objectives. We'll have the so-called research questions or research hypothesis or the assumptions, depending on which style you are going to use. We also have the so-called research methodology, from where we have some component in it. We have the scope of the study, we call it sometimes the limitation, and we have the so-called limitations of your study you need to predict. And we have then we go to number 8, which is the significance, after which we'll have the so-called timelines or the time frame, the tentative time bound from which you are going to carry out your study from time to this time. You need to be specific. And we'll end up with the so-called the references or biography. And therefore, before we go into detail of each of these components, let me go back a little bit and highlight of some of the main important ideas. I will take you somewhere black. We'll take you somewhere here, where this will be the beginning of our discussion. We'll take almost 10 to 20 minutes. That's over. So we have the so-called research proposal, and we are going to look on their many components. Okay? Here we're going to see what it is, what does it mean when we speak about the research proposal, and what are the main components. These are the only 2 objectives of our day. But remember, at the end of this video, if you find this more useful and relevant, that can even be helpful for you and your friends, please don't worry. Please subscribe it and then notify. Make a notification by clicking this bell-like shape, and then share to others. And leave us comments if you find that you need more explanation. And please visit my YouTube. It's under the name of Research Techniques and Concept by Marunguja. When you type this in YouTube video, it automatically come up with a variety of video that you can even go through. When we speak about the research proposal, is nothing rather, it's a blueprint which tries to give out the entire how are you going to do with your study, the entire plan of your study. And it's just a summary of the proposed study, giving out what are the things that will happen in the process of carrying out your study. We have variety of the types of this research proposal, depending on its types of the sources of whatever. We have the so-called the grant proposal, or the grant research proposal. This is based on the funding process. When you ask it to write a proposal so that you are requesting for a particular fund to conduct a particular project, what we call it a grant proposal. It has its structure and way forward. And we have the so-called the project proposal. These are normally the proposals which are designed to perform a particular project. So that to achieve this particular project, I should do 1, 2, 3, 4 in this particular format. And these are the way forward. And then we are more focused with the so-called the academic related proposal, which we call it academic proposal. And there are more of the types. So these are the main, as I said, we have the title, the main component of this research proposal. I have tried to mention to you, then I'm going direct on how of this component has in its components. We have the first one, which is called, what we call it the title. While preparing your research, first of all, you need to have an idea. From that particular idea, you will construct a so-called a tentative title. And this title will be in comprising all the components that you need to go and work on it. That's why the title should be clearly stated, which should indicate the variables. And it should have some keywords of which it will be in comprising all the ideas within your study. Then the second one is an introduction. An introduction is very important because under this introduction, I tried to categorize them into two specific subsections where you will have the so-called background information. Under this particular category, you are going to give up the brief introductions with how is your studies all about. What are you going to do with that particular study? Summarize what is the current status of that particular situation. What the issue that are existing? What is its significance? Why do you find that the state is relevant for the current situation? And then after which you need to go through some literatures. You justify your information with some literature reviews. You survey some literatures from where you need to tell us how others have done about that particular related study. Show the magnitudes of the situation, where did this problem started, what, why, and when. What the existing situation and what is missing. That's what is missing, the gap now, where from you come up with what we call the statement of the problems. So this is very important situation that you need to highlight while preparing your introduction. Then after the introduction, you come up with what we call the objectives. It's from these introductions, you come up with what is missing. From what is missing, then you come up with some several objectives from which you are going to deal or to come up with findings related to these objectives. You will have your objectives, of which might be you need to generate the so-called the overall objectives or the general objectives, and then you have the specific objective. And this objective should adhere to the so-called the term SMART: measurable, systematic, achievable, or attainable, and it should be under time frame, the so-called SMART. Then after the so-called objectives, you need to have the so-called the research questions. And normally these research questions, they root or they came from the specific objectives. From the specific objective, you need to create the specific questions or the specific hypothesis or the assumptions. And these are the main key role players of your study, because it's within these research questions or the research hypothesis or the research assumptions or the indicators is where you are going to create your questionnaire, if you are intending to use questionnaire, or if you are doing a so-called experimental kind of research, you're going to create your hypothesis on which you are trying to answer those objectives after you go through the field work or in experimental style, after which you collect the data, then you will answer the so-called research questions, the research hypothesis, or the assumptions. Sometimes we call it indicators. Then after which you go the number 6, which I use to call it the research methodology. This is very important sections. And this research methodology, you need to define out what is the place. Where are you going to conduct this study? Give us the location. Try to show us the coordinates, the place name. Show us if it is in the field or you are doing the lab related studies. And then under the same style, you need to define the approach which you are going to use. I want to use the so-called quantitative approach, qualitative or quantitative approach, or we are going to move to use the so-called mixed approach. You need also to define the research designs for samplings and sample size determinations. How are you going to make the sample? How are you going to make sampling? Which style, which techniques will it be used? What will be the sample size? What will be the sampling frame? What will be the sampling unit? And what will be the unit of analysis? These are some of the very important issues that a researcher needs to understand in his research proposal under this research methodology. Then after, you need to indicate clearly the method that you're going to use while collecting the data. Which instrument will be used for data collection? Or sometimes we call it the tools. Are you going to use the so-called socioeconomic related studies like questionnaire, interviews, panel discussion, group discussion, forecasting, group discussion, historical trend analysis? Of which type of data analysis method are you going to use? Surveys, or there are several data correction methods that you need to highlight depending on your study. You need to be specific with the specific method or to a specific questions or to a specific research hypothesis. And then under this particular, you need also to highlight the data analytical techniques. Which statistical analytical technique are you going to do? How are you going to deal with your data in an analysis component? Please, you are required to give out with all the statistical part that you'll be performing related to your study, that is a data analytical techniques. Then after which, you will go to the section number 7, which I call it the scope of the study, or sometimes we call it delineation. The scope of the study is tell us the so-called what are you going to include in your study and what are you not going to include, which is a concept of inclusion and exclusion. This is very important because you cannot do everything within a particular area of study. You need to be specified to a particular bound that I will be looking on this particular area, but I will limit myself into this particular site. And though this particular component are important in this study, but I will not do because of 1, 2, 3. And thus, the material that will limit you to perform some of those other activities is what we call the limitations. Then you need also to predict what are the components or what are the factors that could limit your study. Clearly, you need to predict and show. And the end of the day that you have on the report writing, you need to tell us what were some of the limitations that would hinder some of your achievement in your proposed study. And come up with the significance. Tell us now, show what the contributions of your study, how do you find that your study is more relevant to be performed rather than what they are existing in relation to that particular perspectives, which know and how good it is. These are some of the important components that you need to take into consideration while doing this so-called research proposal. And then we'll have the so-called the time frame or the timeline. Please tell us. And from this particular time to this particular time, maybe I'll be doing data literature review. Maybe from this particular time to this particular time, I will be doing field study. From this time to this time, I will be doing data correction. From this time to this time, I will be doing data analysis. And then from this time to this time, so I will be doing interpretation and report writing. And at the end of the day, I will do this and this. And this one will cost about this particular number of amount of materials. You need also to give out what we call the requirement, time frames, and budget if necessary, particularly for the funding project and all other related perspectives. But time frame is very, very important. Then after we end up tell us where did you get some of the information that are trying to support your work. These are some of the important components that as a researcher, a young researcher, a beginner, you need to take into account. Therefore, with this particular short clarification, hope you have something to do with it. I'm sure you can write now a very strong, very relevant, a so-called proposal, a research proposal, an academic research proposal. I ask you once again, please subscribe, share, and comment. And if you find this relevant, you can ask more. Visit my YouTube by the name of Research Techniques and Concept by Marunguja. With this particular perspectives, I would like to say thank you once again.